Evening rain thinned into a silver mist over the lake as the last of the laughter drifted through Adrian Bennett's glass and stone mansion, the kind of house that wore its wealth quietly. Long planes of oak, soft pools of light, a piano no one had touched all night. Servers ghosted between round tables, lifting champagne flutes and vanished napkins. Julia Bennett, fiancée, secretary turned something else, heart still racing from the moment the ring slid onto her finger, stepped away from the warmth of congratulations and toward the terrace to breathe air that wasn't perfumed by roses and money. The marble was cool beneath her heels. The glass doors hummed with a faint draft. Somewhere in the hall a coat slipped from a chair and landed without a sound. She reached for the handle, her half-finished champagne tilting. When two women paused in the doorway behind the ficus, voices lowered to a kind of conspiratorial softness that always sounds kinder than it is. She was his secretary, one said, drawing out the S as if it were a warning. It's a phase. He'll realize. The other gave a small, practiced laugh. She's sweet, sure, but plain. And fast, too. Everything happened so fast. Julia didn't move. Not from fear, not even from embarrassment, but from the shock of hearing a story about herself that felt like it belonged to another woman entirely. The scent of rain threaded in from the deck. Beyond the glass, Forest Park dissolved into a charcoal wash, the lake black and slick as spilled ink. She told herself to walk away, to be better than this, to be generous on a night that was supposed to be hers. Instead, she stood very still until the words ran out and the soft click of their heels receded toward the foyer. When she finally stepped onto the terrace, the mist cooled her skin and the noise in her chest loosened. She let the damp settle on her shoulders, lifting her face so the night could claim a little of the heat in her. She had worked late nights for years, building other people's certainty with tidy slides and crisp memos. And if there was one thing she had learned, it was that certainty is a costume people sew for themselves. Tonight, Adrian had chosen her in front of everyone, had lifted her hand and given her a future that sparkled under the chandeliers, and still the mansion felt as if it were watching, deciding if she belonged. She remembered the interview that wasn't an interview, not really. How a problem he'd been circling for months came into focus while she spoke, how his attention, so famously rationed, never left her face. That became a week of collaboration, then a habit of coffee at 11, the hour when ideas are less defended, then trust, then a quiet tenderness that surprised them both. From inside, a door side open, and Adrian appeared, bow tie loosened, tuxedo jacket in one hand. He took in the wet shoulders, the way she held the glass like a talisman, and without commentary draped the jacket around her. Though carried his cologne, warm and cedar sure. "Walk with me," he said, not as an order, not even a request, more like a promise. They moved through corridors that ran along the water, past paintings she didn't recognize, moody skies, winter fields, a river in thaw. The floors muffled their steps. The house seemed built to keep voices soft. In a gallery lined with tall windows, their reflections floated side by side, a little uncertain, as if any sound might scare them off. At the grand staircase, he paused, then gestured left and right. "Two wings," he said lightly, "west and east." It made sense to the architect. His eyes, kind even when he was tired, flicked across her face as if to read a forecast there. "Two wings," she echoed, smiling as if at an eccentricity she'd grow to love. He nodded, but something like caution crossed his features and vanished, a ripple over still water. They climbed a few steps only to pause again and look down at the room they had left. Flowers glowing faintly, servers tucking silver into velvet-lined cases, someone switching off a cluster of pendant lights so that the space became gentler, the edges blurred. "This house," he said after a moment, lifting her hand to his mouth, pressing a kiss where the ring caught the light. "This life, it's yours." She believed him because she wanted to, because she had spent years being the person who steadies other people's futures, and for once someone had steadied hers. Still, As they walked the upper hall, Julia sensed it again. The mansion's quiet, not hostile at all, simply the kind of quiet that comes from rooms with their own memories. She let her fingertips drift over the smooth rail, the coolness gathering in her skin, and told herself that unease is another costume, that joy often arrives wearing nervousness like a shawl. Outside, the rain strengthened and began to drum on the skylight above them, a soft, persistent percussion. Down in the glass wall that faced the lake, their reflections split along a seam of darkness, two halves of one view, perfectly divided. She leaned into him, and he laughed in that low way he had when relief overtook his poise, and the house accepted the sound the way the lake accepts a thrown stone. Later, when the last car curled down the drive and the night fully reclaimed its hush, Julia stood at the top of the stairs and looked left, then right, 2 wings, 2 worlds, and felt an impulse she didn't recognize, not to choose, not yet, to let the house keep its secrets one more evening. She didn't know it, couldn't have known it, but the detail she smiled at now as an architectural quirk would soon feel like a line drawn through her life, neat and merciless, the first visible edge of something buried and breathing just out of sight. The house settled into silence after the celebration, but that silence was not peace. It was the pause between 2 separate worlds learning how to coexist. Julia had expected the first night in her new home to feel like a continuation of the promise Adrian had whispered to her on the stairs. Instead, when they reached the landing, he smiled, brushed a strand of hair from her cheek, and said with that composed warmth of his, "Left is your wing, right is mine. Women don't cross to the right side." She thought he was teasing, the kind of private joke couples create to make distance feel playful. But when she turned to ask what he meant, his eyes didn't flicker with humor. They were steady, careful, like a man delivering a rule rather than a jest. He opened the door to her side of the house, a suite of rooms scented faintly of cedar and lavender, soft rugs, the lake visible through wide glass panes. "You'll have everything you need here," he said, touching her arm as if to anchor her there. "Tomorrow we'll move your things." She wanted to ask, "And you?" But he was already looking toward the other hallway, the one he'd claimed as his own. The words stayed in her throat. When he left, the sound of his footsteps on marble grew small, then vanished, leaving her alone with the hum of the house and the distant beat of rain on the skylight. She lay awake for hours, her body still, her mind circling. The bed was enormous, the kind meant for a couple to occupy together, yet it felt like a stage where she was the only actor left after the audience had gone home. From the window, she could see the faint shimmer of the right wing, lights low, a single shadow passing by. For a moment, she thought it was Adrian moving about his study, and the thought comforted her. Then she noticed the shadow's stride was slower, heavier, and it turned away from the light entirely. Days began to fold into one another, orderly and polite. They took breakfast together in a bright kitchen that smelled of roasted coffee and lemon polish. Adrian would ask about her sleep, her plans for the day, then check his watch as if confirming that domesticity fit into the margins of his schedule. They drove to the office in separate cars, returned at twilight, dined at the long table that overlooked the water, exchanged the kind of soft conversation that photographs well but leaves no warmth behind. Every night ended the same. He would close his laptop, kiss her temple, and say, "Good night, Julia." She would nod, pretending not to count how many nights in a row the words were identical. Then he would walk toward the right hallway, open the heavy walnut door, and disappear inside. She learned to listen for the subtle click that meant the lock had turned. She told herself not to overthink it. Some men needed solitude, a sanctuary. Adrian had built empires from discipline. Maybe separation was how he stayed balanced. But the human heart, given too many explanations, starts to hear them as lies. The right wing drew her curiosity the way a closed book does when you already know its ending is meant to hurt. One evening, when she returned early from the city, she found Doris Lane, the housekeeper, carrying a tray of tea toward the right side. Julia greeted her casually and asked, "Do you bring tea there every night?" Doris hesitated, eyes flicking toward the forbidden hallway. "Mr. Bennet likes routine," she said carefully, "and I respect routines." Then, almost in a whisper, "He says it helps him sleep." Julia smiled to hide her unease. When Doris left, she walked to the line where the marble floor shifted shade, a subtle change that marked the divide between wings. She stood there, half tempted to step over, but something in the air stopped her. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the weight of a secret she could feel pressing through the walls. That night, when Adrian kissed her goodnight, she held onto his wrist longer than usual. "You can stay here," she murmured. He looked down at her, tired, affectionate, and a little distant. "Tomorrow," he said, the same word that postpones all difficult things. Then he slipped away. Julia sat in bed afterward, tracing the grain of the wood on the headboard, listening to the faint sounds that came from the right wing. Footsteps that didn't match his, the quiet creak of a chair, something like pages turning. The house was alive in halves, and she belonged to only one of them. By the end of the week, the perfection of their marriage felt rehearsed, a performance staged between two locked doors. Every conversation was kind, every gesture measured. To outsiders, they would look radiant, an enviable couple. But inside the house, warmth moved along corridors she couldn't follow. Each night, when the lights dimmed, the reflection on the glass divided again. Her world and his parallel but untouching, two wings of the same dream, slowly learning they would never meet. The wedding day unfolded in gold and laughter, a rehearsal of perfection. Julia had told herself that marriage would close the distance that lingered like a shadow between her and Adrian. After all, vows were supposed to collapse walls, not build them. When she saw him waiting for her at the end of the aisle, poised, composed, the picture of devotion, she believed it. Their guests believed it. Even the house, lit in celebration that evening, seemed to breathe easier, its glass panes glowing like lanterns in the rain. They returned late, the echo of applause still ringing in their ears. Adrian guided her inside with a gentle hand at her back, murmuring, "Welcome home, Mrs. Bennet." The title sounded strange, like a costume she wasn't used to wearing yet. She kicked off her shoes, laughing softly. "So, which way tonight? Left or right?" she teased. He smiled, but something in the curve of it faltered. The laughter in her throat dimmed as she caught the subtle tightening of his shoulders. He reached for her hand, then let it go before their fingers could settle. "Let's sit," he said. His voice had changed, slower, lower. The kind of tone people use before delivering bad news. Julia hesitated, but sat across from him in the small lounge at the base of the staircase. The house had gone still, the staff dismissed, the rain thinning into silence. Adrian stared at his wedding band as if weighing its significance. "There's something I've never told you," he began. "Something about my family." She leaned forward, half smiling. "I already know your father passed, your mother," he cut in quietly. "Not just that. I have a brother, a twin." The room seemed to exhale. For a second, Julia wondered if she'd misheard him. "A twin? You mean he's alive?" Adrian nodded. "His name is Matthew. He lives here, in the West Wing." Julia blinked, searching his face for any sign of irony. "Lives here? You mean he's been here all this time?" "Yes." Adrian's voice was even, controlled, but his eyes betrayed the exhaustion of carrying a secret too long. "He doesn't leave that part of the house. Hasn't for years." The silence that followed wasn't heavy, it was cold. "Why?" Julia asked finally. "He's not well," Adrian said. "When we were kids, our mother died in front of him. He was 12. Something in him shut down that day. He stopped speaking. The doctors called it trauma-induced mutism. He understands everything, but he doesn't talk, and he's afraid of the outside world." Julia's throat tightened. "And you never told me." "I wanted to," Adrian said, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "But how do you explain something like that on a second date? Or the 10th? I thought if I waited until we were steady, you'd see it the way I do, not as a burden, but as part of my life. She rose, pacing to the window. The reflection of the lake shimmered on the glass, fractured by the movement of wind. So while I was planning our wedding, he was right there, behind a wall. He nodded. He paints, reads. I built this house with him in mind, 2 wings, so he could live comfortably without feeling trapped. He doesn't see anyone else except Doris and me. And now me, Julia whispered. Adrian stood and reached for her hand again. I hope so. You're the only person I've ever met who reminds me of our mother. There's something in your kindness, your patience. I think he'll respond to that. She turned to him, stunned. You want me to meet him? Yes, eventually. Not tonight. He needs time to adjust. Adjust? Her voice cracked. To what? To the fact that his brother got married without telling his wife she'd be sharing a home with a stranger. Please, Adrian said, the calm finally breaking in his tone. I didn't want to lose you over something that doesn't change who we are. Julia looked at him, the man she'd promised her life to only hours ago, and felt something unfamiliar move through her chest. Not anger, not even fear, but the sharp chill of disorientation. It was as if the house itself shifted beneath her feet, revealing new corridors she hadn't known existed. I married you, she said slowly, but it feels like I married both of you. He closed his eyes for a moment, exhaling as if he'd expected that. In a way, you did, he admitted. Matthew and I are 2 halves of the same life. I can't abandon him. Her gaze drifted toward the right hallway. A thin light seeped under the door at the end. For the first time, she realized she wasn't looking at a house divided by architecture. It was divided by grief. And she was standing on the border. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. Then, I guess this marriage has 3 people in it. Adrian didn't answer. He only looked at her with that haunted tenderness she'd mistaken for depth. And Julia felt the invisible presence behind the wall pulse like another heartbeat in the house. 2 brothers, one silent, one guilty, and now her, the bride who had walked into a mansion and found it already occupied by ghosts that were still alive. Adrian tried to stop her the moment she said it, but Julia had already straightened her shoulders in that quiet, final way that meant there would be no argument. If I'm your wife, she said, her voice steady though her pulse raced, I deserve to know who lives under the same roof. He hesitated by the doorway, his expression torn between fatigue and something close to fear. It's late, he murmured. He's not ready for visitors. Then he'll have to adjust, she replied, stepping into her shoes. So will I. The rain had stopped, leaving the air inside the house thick with that damp metallic scent that comes after a storm. They climbed the stairs together without speaking. The floorboards softened their footsteps until the only sound left was the faint hum of the house. Pipes settling, wind slipping through vents. When they reached the threshold to the west wing, Adrian paused again, hand on the knob. He may not look at you, he warned softly. Don't take it personally. He doesn't respond the way we do. Julia nodded, though she didn't understand. The door opened with a sigh, releasing the smell of oil, paint, and turpentine. The air was cooler here, heavier, as if it had been untouched for years. A single lamp burned on a table beside an armchair. In its pool of amber light sat a man who could have been Adrian's reflection if not for the stillness. Matthew Bennett didn't move when they entered. He sat back in the chair, a book open on his lap, head tilted slightly, gaze unfocused. The resemblance was uncanny. Same high cheekbones, same line of jaw, but his skin was paler, almost translucent, and his eyes carried no recognition. Only depth, like glass darkened from the inside. Adrian cleared his throat, that awkward formality of a man who had explained too many things already. Matthew, he said quietly, this is Julia, my wife. No reaction, only the faint flicker of his eyes, a slow shift of focus toward Julia that felt more like the study of light than a human glance. Julia forced a small smile. It's nice to meet you, she said, Her voice sounded too bright, the way people speak to someone they aren't sure can hear them. Nothing. Not a nod, not a sound. She tried again, lighter. Adrian's told me a little about you. Though not enough to warn me how much you two look alike. It's uncanny. Still nothing. She glanced at her husband, but he was staring at his brother, a muscle in his jaw tightening. He's listening, Adrian murmured, as if that were enough. Julia stepped closer, pretending not to notice the faint unease crawling up her spine. The room was filled with canvases leaned against walls, brush jars, unfinished sketches, landscapes, portraits, a pair of identical boys standing beside a woman whose face had been left blank. She felt something constrict in her chest. "It's beautiful work," she said, running her eyes across the paintings. "You must be very talented." Matthew's gaze followed her movements, sharp now, like a camera lens adjusting focus. When her hand brushed the edge of a canvas, he made a small, abrupt motion, one finger twitching, a silent warning. She froze, withdrew her hand. "I'm sorry," she whispered instinctively. He blinked once, then returned to stillness. Adrian touched her shoulder. "We should go," he said. His voice was low, uneasy. "He's had enough for tonight." Julia nodded, though curiosity burned through her confusion. She turned to leave, and that was when it happened, barely a second, but it rooted her in place. As she stepped past him, Matthew reached out, almost absently, and his fingers brushed the silver bracelet on her wrist. Not her skin, just the metal, a ghost of contact that sent a chill up her arm. His hand lingered there for a fraction of a breath before falling back to his lap. When she looked at him, his eyes were no longer empty. There was recognition now, quiet, searching, and something else she couldn't name. Adrian didn't see it. He was already at the door, murmuring a distracted goodnight. Julia followed, every nerve awake. Back in their hallway, Adrian exhaled and tried for calm. "He didn't frighten you, did he?" "No," she said slowly. "Just surprised me." He smiled, the weary kind that ends conversations. "You handled it better than I hoped." But as Julia undressed later, the feel of that light touch lingered on her skin, cold and deliberate. She lay awake long after Adrian's footsteps faded to the other side of the house, staring at the ceiling and thinking of Matthew's eyes, how they had seemed both foreign and familiar, as if he were not meeting her for the first time, but remembering her from somewhere he could not return. Adrian proposed it one Sunday morning while the mist still hung low over the lake, a quiet fog pressing against the windows. Julia was standing by the counter, pouring coffee, when he said almost casually, "I've been thinking maybe Matthew could paint you." She turned, startled. "Me?" "He hasn't worked on portraits in years," Adrian continued, "but you're someone he might respond to. It could help him." Julia hesitated. She didn't know what help meant anymore. Help for Matthew, or help for Adrian's guilt, but she nodded. "If he wants to." He smiled, relieved. "He will." The next morning, Doris led her to the West Wing, where the light smelled faintly of oil and pine. The air there always felt different, denser, quieter, like a church that had forgotten its congregation. Matthew stood by the window, arranging brushes. He didn't greet her, but gestured politely to a chair by the far wall. Adrian's instructions had been clear. Just sit, don't try to talk, don't force connection. And so she sat. The first day, he studied her for a long time, then began sketching in slow, deliberate movements, the scratch of charcoal soft against the hush of the room. For several mornings, this became their rhythm. She would sit near the window, hands folded in her lap, while Matthew painted in silence. The light shifted, the fire crackled faintly. Sometimes a bird hit the glass with a dull thud and they both flinched, but no words were ever exchanged. She had never realized how loud silence could be when it was shared. At first, she thought she was just enduring it for Adrian's sake. But after a few days, something changed. She began to look forward to those hours. There was something freeing in not having to fill the air with small talk, in being seen without having to perform. Matthew never smiled, but his gaze was steady, reverent almost. It was not the way a man looked at a woman. It was the way a painter studies light. Sometimes she caught him watching the way her hands rested over her stomach, how she touched the bracelet he had once brushed. Other times, when he stepped close to adjust the easel, she could smell turpentine, linen, and something faintly human, like paper warmed by breath. Adrian, meanwhile, was drifting further away. He came home later each night, always tired, always distracted. When she tried to ask about his work, he'd wave it off with a faint smile and change the subject. His absences stretched longer, his apologies shorter. The house had begun to echo again. By the end of the second week, the portrait was nearly finished. Matthew's brushstrokes had grown confident, urgent, as if he were painting against time. Julia found herself curious, almost anxious to see it. But every time she tried to glance, he would stop her with a silent gesture, head shaking, eyes sharp. She obeyed. Then, one afternoon, as rain murmured outside and the air smelled of wet leaves, he finally stepped back and lowered the brush. He looked at her, then at the painting, then nodded once. "May I?" she asked quietly. He said nothing, but his expression softened, a kind of permission. Julia rose and crossed the room. Her breath caught the instant she saw it. The woman on the canvas was her, unmistakably her. Same soft hair, same gray dress, but her hands were resting on a rounded belly, full and tender beneath the fabric. Her mouth went dry. "How did you?" She turned to him, but he was already lowering his gaze. For the first time, she saw something alive move across his face, sorrow and understanding woven together. He reached for a rag, cleaning his hand slowly, refusing to meet her eyes. Julia pressed her palm to her abdomen. She hadn't told anyone. She hadn't even taken the test. Her heart pounded, so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. That night, long after Adrian returned and fell asleep on his side of the house, Julia crept into the bathroom with trembling hands. The test sat on the counter, silent and definitive. 2 lines. Clear. She stared until her reflection blurred. A strange calm settled over her, heavier than fear, lighter than joy. The next morning, she found herself walking toward the west wing before dawn. The door was open, light spilling through. Matthew sat by the same easel reading. When she entered, he looked up, not startled, not guilty, only aware. Their eyes met, and for a moment it felt as if words were unnecessary. He knew. Julia didn't speak. She simply nodded, the smallest acknowledgement. From that day, she began to trust him in ways she couldn't explain. They still didn't talk, but she no longer felt invisible in that silence. It was Matthew, not Adrian, who noticed when she looked pale, who poured her water without asking, who paused his work when she closed her eyes in exhaustion. Adrian remained polite, distracted, grateful in the abstract. The gulf between them widened quietly, politely, like a door closing without a sound. And somewhere between the smell of oil paint and the hush of those mornings, Julia realized that the man who spoke no words had somehow become the only one in the house who truly heard her. The storm came without warning. Thunder blooming over the lake, the kind that made the windows tremble and the trees shudder against their roots. Julia sat by the window, waiting for the sound of tires on the gravel drive, the familiar flash of headlights that meant Adrian was home. But the road remained dark. She called once, then twice, and when he didn't answer, she told herself he was stuck in traffic or waiting out the rain somewhere safe. It wasn't until nearly midnight that her phone rang. The voice on the other end was professional, calm in that way that only deepens dread. "Mrs. Bennett, this is OHSU Hospital. Your husband's been in an accident. He's in critical condition. We need you to come." Her body moved before her mind caught up. Coat, keys, the echo of the front door slamming behind her. The drive into Portland blurred, a tunnel of rain and light. She barely remembered parking or the sliding doors that swallowed her into the sterile brightness of the emergency wing. Adrian lay surrounded by machines, his skin pale against the crisp white sheets. A nurse explained the extent of his injuries: head trauma, fractures, swelling they were trying to manage. "He's stable for now, but he's in a coma," she said softly, as if the word might break. Julius sank into the chair beside him and took his hand. It was cold, unresponsive, but heavy with the familiarity of years. "You said you wouldn't leave me alone in that house," she whispered. "So don't." For days, she lived in that chair, reading aloud from the newspaper, from his favorite novels, recounting fragments of conversations they'd never finished. She told him about the lake, about the first bloom of spring lilacs, about the smell of rain she still couldn't wash from her coat. The doctors came and went, adjusting drips, murmuring updates she barely heard. The world outside shrank to the rhythm of his heartbeat on the monitor, steady but far away, like footsteps on another floor. When she finally went home to rest, the house felt different. The silence no longer polite, but watchful. She turned on every light and stood in the kitchen, uncertain what to do with her hands. Then she noticed the faint scent of tea. The kettle was still warm, a single cup resting beside it. On the counter, a folded napkin with 4 words written in careful, uneven handwriting. "Eat something, Julia." Her throat tightened. She hadn't told Matthew where she was going or how long she'd be gone. Yet somehow he knew. Over the next few days, the quiet gestures continued. The dishes were washed. The hall lights dimmed at dusk. Fresh towels appeared by the door. She caught glimpses of Matthew at the far end of the corridor, carrying firewood, refilling the bird feeder, moving with that slow, deliberate grace that barely disturbed the air around him. They never spoke. She didn't know if he could, or if he chose not to, but she began leaving notes, simple things at first. "Thank you. Tea was perfect. He's still sleeping." Each morning, her notes would vanish, replaced by a new one in that same steady handwriting. One night, she returned from the hospital exhausted, the kind of tired that erases thought. The living room smelled faintly of paint. Matthew's easel had been moved near the fire. He was standing before it, brush poised, his face half hidden by the dim light. She almost turned away, not wanting to intrude, but something in the canvas caught her. It was a pair of hands, one slender and pale, the other broader, rougher. They were clasped tightly, knuckles pressed white, as if anchoring each other against the void. One hand bore a wedding ring. The other did not. Julia stared until her vision blurred. The flames cracked softly, throwing light across the room. When she looked up, Matthew had stepped back, watching her reaction. His eyes were unreadable, but there was no mistaking what he'd painted. It wasn't just a portrait of connection. It was confession, an unspoken truth neither of them could name. She wanted to say something, anything, but the words refused to form. Instead, she nodded once, a small acknowledgement, and turned toward the stairs. That night, she sat awake beside her husband's empty side of the bed, the storm gone, only the drip of rain from the gutters breaking the quiet. Somewhere down the hall, a brush moved over canvas, slow and deliberate, and though no words had passed between them, she felt it, the fragile thread that bound her to Matthew now, born not of romance, but of grief, solitude, and the strange comfort of being seen by someone who never spoke at all. By the 8th month, the days had grown heavy with heat and silence. Julia's visits to the hospital had become ritual: morning drives to OHSU, the slow walk through sterile corridors, the soft beep of monitors marking time in place of breath. Adrian hadn't woken. The doctors spoke of hope with careful restraint, measuring every word. She sat by his bed, reading the same novel she had started weeks ago, her voice steady though her throat ached. "You'll be home soon," she whispered each time before leaving, tucking a pressed wildflower into his hand like a secret charm. That night, she returned to the lake house with the kind of exhaustion that made the world tilt at its edges. Rain pressed gently against the windows, and the air smelled of cinnamon and wax. She wanted the house to feel less like a waiting room, so she decided to bake something simple, a birthday cake. It was the twins' birthday the next day, a small detail Adrian had once mentioned in passing, the way people do when memories still carry weight. "We were born minutes apart," he'd said, smiling, "but he never lets me forget who came first." She moved through the kitchen methodically, flour, sugar, eggs, milk, each motion grounding her. Somewhere in the West Wing, Matthew's footsteps creaked faintly, the same slow rhythm as always. She took comfort in it, the proof that she wasn't alone in the house. But halfway through frosting the cake, a sharp pain tore through her abdomen. At first, she thought it was nothing, another false cramp, the kind her doctor had warned about. She gripped the counter, breathing through it, counting the seconds. Then the next one came harder, deeper. Her breath hitched. She dropped the spatula, sugar scattering across the tiles like shards of glass. Her mind blurred into instinct. She turned toward the phone on the far counter, but another contraction folded her in half. "No, not yet," she gasped, pressing a hand against her belly. "Please, not now." The pain pulsed again, and suddenly warmth spread down her legs. The realization came like lightning. Her water had broken. She staggered toward the hallway, clutching the wall for balance. The phone in the living room felt impossibly far. "Matthew!" she screamed, her voice raw, echoing through the house. "Matthew!" Footsteps thundered from the other wing, faster than she'd ever heard them. He appeared in the doorway, pale and wide-eyed, the quietness that always surrounded him shattered by alarm. For a moment, he simply froze, taking in the scene, the trembling, the blood, the terror in her eyes. Then he moved. He grabbed the phone, dialed 911, and listened. Julia could hear the calm voice on the other end, tinny and distant. "Tell them," she tried to say, but another contraction cut her off. She fell to her knees, clutching the edge of the sofa. Matthew crouched beside her, phone pressed between shoulder and ear, his hand shaking as he followed instructions. It's happening," he managed, his voice rough, disused. "Now." The dispatcher guided him step by step, his silence broken by hoarse fragments of breath. "Yes, towels, boiling water, okay." He spread a blanket on the floor, knelt, and tried to steady her. His face was white with panic, but his hands were gentle. "It's all right," Julia whispered, though nothing was all right. Her world had narrowed to pain and light, her body convulsing in waves. She wanted Adrian, wanted his voice, but all she had was Matthew, this stranger who looked like her husband, but spoke in gestures and shadows. He squeezed her hand. His palm was warm, grounding. She felt him tremble, then heard the faintest sound, his first attempt at words in decades. "Breathe," he rasped. It was barely a whisper, but she heard it. Time fractured after that. The contractions blurred together, her voice breaking into cries she couldn't control. Matthew's hands never left hers, his breaths matching hers. He followed every instruction the dispatcher gave, repeating each step under his breath as if praying. Then, after one last agonizing push, a sound filled the room that erased everything else, the sharp, new cry of a baby. Julia collapsed back, tears spilling down her face. The world came rushing back in, the rain, the scent of cinnamon, the steady tremor of thunder outside. Matthew held the newborn in his shaking hands, staring as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. He wrapped the tiny body in a towel, cradling it awkwardly but protectively. The baby's cries softened. Matthew's lips parted. His voice came out raw and broken, the first real sound he had made in over 20 years. "Welcome, little one," he whispered. Julia's breath caught. He looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time, there was no wall of silence between them, only shared awe, raw and unfiltered. When the paramedics arrived minutes later, they found her resting against the sofa, the child asleep in her arms, Matthew sitting beside her in shock, his hand stained with paint and life. She turned to him weakly as they lifted her onto the stretcher. "You spoke," she murmured, voice trembling with disbelief. He didn't answer. His eyes were wet, but his expression was peaceful, like a man who had finally surfaced after years underwater. As the ambulance doors closed, Julia caught one last glimpse of him standing in the doorway, rain haloing his figure, the flicker of light from the easel behind him illuminating the walls. Later, she would realize that in that single night, the silence that had bound the house for so long had finally broken, not through tragedy, but through the smallest miracle of all, a voice reborn in the moment life began. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and rain-soaked pavement, the kind of clean that feels too sharp against memory. 3 days had passed since the birth. Julia moved carefully through the corridors, her body still aching, her heart split between exhaustion and fragile hope. The baby, small, warm, perfect, slept in her arms, wrapped in a soft blue blanket. Matthew walked beside her, silent as ever, but different now. The silence no longer felt like absence. It carried intention, awareness. His eyes were clear, his posture steady. He had changed in ways that went beyond speech. When they reached the ICU, Julia hesitated at the doorway. Adrian lay where he always had, pale and unmoving beneath the steady pulse of the monitors. But something about the room felt lighter, as if some invisible weight had been lifted. She approached slowly, her steps echoing in the stillness. "He's waiting for you," she whispered to Matthew, motioning him forward. Matthew froze for a moment, the instinctive hesitation of someone who had lived too long behind walls. Then he stepped toward the bed. Julia watched him study his brother's face, the same jawline, the same faint scar near the temple, small differences like mirror distortions. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, with a trembling hand, he reached out and took Adrian's wrist. His fingers brushed the hospital bracelet, then slid down until their palms met. "Wake up, brother," he whispered. The sound was soft, but it carried. Julia felt it like a current through the room. The monitors kept their rhythm, steady, indifferent. Then, almost imperceptibly, Adrian's fingers twitched. A muscle moved in his jaw. Julia's breath caught. "Do it again," she urged softly. Matthew leaned closer, tears gathering in the corners of his eyes. "Wake up," he repeated, firmer this time, his voice rough, as if each word was pulled from deep within. Adrian's eyelids fluttered. The monitor beeped faster, a quick pulse of possibility. Julia stepped forward, heart pounding. "Adrian, it's me. It's Julia. You're safe." His eyes opened, dazed, unfocused at first, then searching. When he saw Matthew, something inside him seemed to break open. He tried to speak, but his throat only managed a cracked sound. Julia pressed a hand to his shoulder. "It's okay," she said, tears spilling freely. "You don't have to talk." Adrian turned his gaze back to his brother, confusion and wonder tangled in his expression. Matthew smiled, awkward, trembling but real. He reached out again, this time gripping Adrian's hand tightly. For years, Matthew had lived in silence while Adrian carried both their voices. Now, in this quiet room, the balance shifted. Julia felt it in the air, the symmetry, the strange grace of it all. The man who had once gone mute had spoken life back into the one who never stopped talking. The nurse entered, startled by the movement. She called for the doctor, but Julia barely heard. Her focus stayed on the two brothers, Adrian whispering something she couldn't make out, Matthew nodding, his lips trembling in reply. When the nurse left to fetch the team, Julia stood at the foot of the bed, the baby stirring softly against her chest. The faint morning light slanted across the floor, and for the first time in months, the room felt alive. Adrian reached a shaky hand toward her. You're okay," he rasped. "I am," she said gently. "We both are." She handed him the baby, guiding the small bundle into his arms. His face softened, disbelief giving way to something pure. "Our son," he whispered, voice cracking. Matthew watched them, a faint smile playing at his mouth. Julia turned to him, but before she could speak, he took a step closer and laid his hand lightly over the baby's back. 3 lives, bound by one improbable miracle. No one spoke for a long time. There was nothing left to explain. The machines hummed, the rain tapped softly at the window, and in the center of it all, silence finally felt like peace. Julia looked at them, the brothers reunited, the circle complete, and felt the years of buried sorrow loosen their hold. The man who had once been mute had given voice to life itself, and the man who had lived only for control had been woken by love. She brushed a tear from her cheek and smiled faintly. The world outside the window was pale and new, and for the first time since she'd entered that house by the lake, Julia felt certain that everything broken had found its way back to light. Spring came early that year, soft and green around the edges of the lake. The rain had thinned to mist. The air smelled faintly of pine and thawing earth. A few months had passed since that day in the hospital, enough for the world to settle back into something resembling ordinary life, though Julia knew nothing in this house would ever be ordinary again. Adrian had recovered slowly, relearning how to walk, how to breathe without pain. He tired easily, but there was light in his eyes now, a gentleness she hadn't seen before. The arrogance that once shaped his every gesture had melted into something quieter. Gratitude, maybe, or humility. He didn't talk much about the accident or the coma or the moment he woke to his brother's voice. But when their gazes met, words were unnecessary. Matthew still lived in the West Wing, though the door between them stayed open now. He spoke sparingly, a handful of words each day, his voice low and rough as gravel. But Julia noticed how he smiled more often, how sometimes he would hum while painting. The silence that had once haunted him now seemed like choice, not curse. The house, too, had changed. It no longer felt divided. Julia could hear Adrian's footsteps cross from east to west, Matthew's voice responding faintly. The laughter of the baby filled the spaces where grief used to live. They named him Ethan Bennett, the strong one. Julia chose it one quiet afternoon while watching sunlight spill across the nursery wall. The name fit him. He was steady even as an infant, calm in her arms, as though he understood that he'd arrived to heal more than one life. On the day Ethan turned 3 months old, Julia walked into the living room carrying him on her hip. The fire burned low, painting the walls with amber light. Above the mantel hung the portrait Matthew had finished months ago, the one of her, round with the life she hadn't yet known she carried. The brush strokes glowed faintly in the firelight, soft but defiant, the embodiment of everything they had survived. She stood there a long while, rocking Ethan gently, her reflection faint beside the painted version of herself. So much had changed since that night. The fear, the waiting, the fragile bridge between love and loss. And yet some part of it remained, captured forever in oil and silence. Adrian joined her a moment later, resting his hand on her shoulder. Matthew passed through the doorway behind them, pausing to look at his work, then at the family before him. For the first time, Julia saw peace in all 3 of their faces, the kind that doesn't erase pain but forgives it. The baby stirred and sighed against her chest, and Julia whispered softly, almost to herself, "Some hearts speak not with words, but through what they choose to save." Outside, the lake mirrored the sky, clear and still. Inside, the house breathed quietly whole again.